following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
This is Lawrence Spivak inviting you to Meet the Press.
Meet the Press, America's press conference of the air and winner of every major award in its field, is a public affairs presentation of NBC News.
Our guests today are two members of the Policy Council of the National Women's Political Caucus. Gloria Steinem, who is the caucus spokeswoman to the Democratic Convention, and Jill Ruckelshaus, who is spokeswoman to the Republican Convention. The caucus was founded in 1971 to win greater participation for women in national affairs and to elect more women to public office. Ms. Steinem is a writer and the editor of the feminist magazine MS. Mrs. Ruckelshaus, a former teacher, is the mother of 5 children. Her husband is administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. We'll have the first questions now from Carl T. Rowan of the Chicago Daily News.
Ms. Steinem, back during the primaries, you referred to Senator George McGovern as the best of the white male candidates. Are you satisfied with the stands he took at the convention and since with regard to women's rights?
No, I'm not completely satisfied with them, but I still consider them the most hopeful. Obviously, from the convention, it's clear that the women there, the majority of the women there, were displeased with the fact that a minority plank on reproductive freedom was not included. We considered it unwise politically, since the majority of Americans and the majority of Catholic Americans as well are in favor of that. But that was the only major request that was made by the National Women's Political Caucus for inclusion in the platform that was not met.
Now, at one time, you said that revolution, not reform, is what's needed. On the basis of what you saw at the Democratic Convention, do you now think women can win rights by working through the political system?
I think we have to use a variety of methods. It was clear to me that our gains in 1972 had a great deal to do with the implicit threat of another 1968. So we can't neglect the ways in which demonstrations and other kinds of techniques influence the changes that are made. In other words, we need a multiplicity of tactics in order to get changes within the system.
Mrs. Ruckelshaus, you were at the Republican Convention. Are you convinced that the Republican Party has now made a firm commitment to women's equality?
Yes, I am convinced of that. I think that there was some confusion, some failure to fully understand the commitment of the women in the party to recognition of the right of women to participate as full partners in society. We went a long way in August in Miami Beach in convincing the leadership, both men and women in the party, that the women throughout the country who are Republicans and who are independents and who are Democrats are committed to winning these rights for themselves, that they will choose the party which offers them the greatest opportunity. I think our party woke up to that fact, and I think their commitment now is quite firm.
Now, one of your colleagues, Betty Friedan, said that the GOP was trying to rip off the Women's Political Caucus, that they were using you and the political caucus. Was this an unfair charge?
Well, I don't think that was quite accurate. We had she was quibbling over a choice of words. The Republican National Committee had a seminar on women's issues, which they called the Republican Women's Political Caucus. As a matter of fact, I think I might have been responsible for choosing those words. There was no attempt to usurp the function of the National Women's Political Caucus.
And I'd like to say in solidarity here that there is a Democratic Women's Political Caucus, too. So there's clearly no partisan attempt to use those words unfairly.
Mrs. Ruckelshaus, Senator McGovern charges that President Nixon has treated the women's movement as a joke. What's your response to that charge?
Well, I think we'll be hearing a lot of charges and counter-charges in that vein. I think that's not true. The Republican Party has established a good record on women's opportunities, women's rights and responsibilities during the last 4 years. Surely it is a step forward from anything that preceded it. It is not enough. There will be more, and the party is committed in a very strong woman's plank in this convention platform to being sure that women are included, that women are given positions of leadership. I don't think that's a fair charge, but I'm sure we'll hear others like it during the campaign, and it will be up to women to be alert to what the facts are as opposed to what the rhetoric is.
Thank you, ladies, and Mr. Rowan. We'll be back to introduce our other panel members and continue the questions in just a minute, but first this message.
One night, my wife and I had been out shopping. As we returned to the car about an hour later, I realized that someone had poured paint remover all over the vehicle. The following morning, when I got to Allstate, I was still angry about the whole affair.
The first thing I did was try to put Mr. Gemmell at ease. We then went out and took a look at the damage to his automobile.
He realized how badly damaged the vehicle was, and he sympathized with me.
I then asked Mr. Gemmell if he had a shop that he wanted to do the work.
But I had no idea how to start in a situation like this.
And I said, well, if you'd like, I'll help you, and I'll get the job done.
So he took control of the whole situation, and he contacted the local body shop.
The body shop and Mr. Gemmell agreed to have the car done. And I sent Mr. Gemmell his check.
The following Friday, when I picked up the car, I could see that they had done a beautiful paint job. Their slogan is for real. I was in good hands with Allstate.
If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't be working here.
Now, back to Meet the Press, an unrehearsed press conference. Here's our moderator, Lawrence Spivak.
We're ready now to resume our interview on Meet the Press. Our guests are Gloria Steinem and Jill Ruckelshaus, two members of the Policy Council of the National Women's Political Caucus. You've just met Carl Rowan of the Chicago Daily News. The other questioners on our panel today are Shana Alexander of Newsweek, James J. Kilpatrick of the Washington Star Syndicate, and Catherine Mackin of NBC News. We'll continue the questions with Ms. Alexander.
Ms. Steinem, I think we would all agree with you that the women's movement has made greater progress in the last year or two than in the 50 years since women got the vote. But since it is a militant movement, I'd like to ask you, as you see it, who is the enemy now?
Well, I wouldn't call it a militant movement because militant connotes violence, and to me that is, I would more likely call the Pentagon a militant movement. It's part of feminist philosophy, as you know, to be, and in fact with women's culture, is much less violent per se than the men's culture per se. But the adversary, which is a word I prefer to enemy, are those individuals who have usurped control of our lives and who in general turn out to be that 3% of the population which is white, male, over 30, and college educated. And that is the pool from which we have taken our leadership, in fact, which I think goes a long way to explaining the poverty of the leadership.
Well, are you saying that the white, male, educated person is the enemy of the women's movement, or the adversary?
Well, from a statistical point of view, that's accurate. I mean, the surveys that have been done of reaction to the women's movement show that group of people, socially upward mobile and so on, shows the most resistance to the movement because they have the most privilege to lose. However, the overall point is that this is a humanist movement, and that, of course, those individuals, even that 3%, has a great deal to gain. I hope that soon they will realize it. I think some individuals have realized it, that the male role is also very restrictive and dehumanizing, and that they themselves have a great deal to gain by this social revolution.
Mr. Kilpatrick.
Ms. Ruckelshaus, Senator McGovern several times has promised that if elected, he will appoint or nominate to the United States Supreme Court a woman. Mr. Nixon's made no such promise from his side. What's your impression of Senator McGovern's promise? Will that win votes for the Democratic nominee?
I'm sure that he is sincere in that statement. I don't question that at all. And I'm not certain that will end up winning votes for him. There is a statement in the woman's plank in the Republican National Party platform which urges the party to appoint women to policy-making positions in the government, including the Supreme Court and the Cabinet. I feel very confident that if the President is reelected, we'll have women in the Cabinet and on the Supreme Court during his second four-year term. I'm not sure that either candidate will be able to capture the women's vote on the basis of promises.
I had understood you to say a moment ago that you felt the women would go with the candidate who made the greatest appeal to them along these lines.
Yes, but appeal is not based on promise. I am a Republican, and I will support the President on the basis of his performance. And during the past 4 years, he has moved women forward through legal directives to his agencies and departments that they have action plans for hiring and promoting women, through his insistence that outside organizations that made contracts with the federal government submit action plans through his appointment to women to policy-making jobs treble the ratio of any previous administration. This is positive performance. This isn't promise.
Ms. Ruckelshaus, I've heard it said that those figures are a little bit phony, that they have to do with grade levels in the civil service, and that by comparing it in this administration against that on a different basis, it makes the Nixon administration look good. What's your response to that?
My response is I'm really not interested in the percentages. I think that argument can be made, perhaps even substantiated. It is clear that more has happened for women to enable women to achieve their full responsibilities and rights under this administration than a previous one. Now, no administration can step back from that. This administration, if it continues 4 years, will go forward. The administration is not the only one which might have done it in this 4-year period, but that is a record of performance upon which the Republican Party can proudly stand.
Ms. Steinem, you feel you must have something to say
on
the subject?
I think, the point of the caucus is to put forth women's issues and women's concerns. And it is a multipartisan organization. And we are especially grateful. I am personally grateful to the women in the Republican Party who are there struggling. And the majority of the women in the caucus, in fact, are neither Republicans nor Democrats, but are independents. I think we have to admit, though, that the record of this administration is not so much a tribute to this administration as a testimony to the poverty that's gone before, because those 118 women, as you say, have been pointed out by the federally employed women here as very dubious statistic, as they include President Nixon's personal secretaries, women in the military who got, fairly routine promotions and the like. So we really have to look at that very, very carefully and understand that in the government, as elsewhere, the women are still the first to be fired and the last to be hired. And they still constitute a very, very small minority of people there at all, and the vast majority, 75%, are in grades 1 to 6, which, of course, are clerical roles.
Ms. Mackin.
Ms. Steinem, if we could just go back and relive the Democratic Convention for a minute here. The women were outmaneuvered twice by the McGovern people, once on the South Carolina vote and once on the abortion issue. In retrospect, do you think there's anything at all you and the National Women's Political Caucus could have done about that?
I don't know, really. I think there was a nervousness about the numerical problem, which was so complex because it so directly affected the California challenge. I'm not sure we could have done anything to calm that nervousness. It's clear it would have been technically possible to support the women's challenge in that case. As for reproductive freedom, I repeat that I think that's a poor political judgment because it simply doesn't reflect the way the majority of Americans feel, and it was showing a sensitivity to a small and very vocal pressure group that McGovern would clearly not allow to happen when it comes to the war, for instance. But it was an enormous victory, I think, for the women in both parties that these issues were raised, that women's issues were probably the most exciting and the most showed the most forward thrust of any issues at either convention.
Would you go along with those people who said that it was more important to nominate McGovern than it was for women to face down these issues, for instance, on South Carolina and on abortion?
No, I think the issues are more important than any candidate.
Ms. Steiner, may I ask you a question? You made a speech before the National Press Club this year, and you said, and I quote, "Women are not taken seriously. We are undervalued, ridiculed, or ignored by a society which consciously and unconsciously assumes that the white male is the standard and the norm." Now, what's your explanation for this serious state of affairs in view of the fact that males are at least virtually controlled and dominated by women from birth to puberty and often beyond that? Why haven't you done a better job if you're as smart as you say you are?
Well, that's your statement, not mine, that men are virtually controlled by women from birth onward. I mean, if you take an intelligent person with the normal hopes and ambitions and confine her to the home, she becomes sometimes over-dominating within those four walls, as a man would be as well. But the truth of her situation is that she has no real power over her life outside the home, nor does she have power over the economics or the politics of her life. So, I wouldn't accept the premise of that statement.
Well, hasn't she an opportunity to brainwash the male during those early formative years? Why doesn't she do it?
Well, I think it's beginning to change, not to brainwash, but to be objective for a change and to eliminate the sex and the race stereotypes. But women have been encouraged to invest their hopes and their dreams in their male children and convinced that their female children could not meet those expectations, and to depend on their male children in their old age and so on, and have been made to realize the rather severe danger and risks of not perpetuating the small amount of well-being that they have in the system as it is. What kind of choice is it, after all, to be able to go out and earn half as much as a man for doing the very same work? Could she support her family? Could she support her children? Could her daughter? Should she tell her daughter that she could? I think not.
Miss Alexander.
Mrs. Ruckelshaus, the latest Gallup poll indicated that 2 out of 3 Americans believe that abortion is a matter to be decided between a woman and her physician. And yet both political candidates seem to be ducking that issue completely. Would that lead you to conclude that the people are more for abortion than the practical politicians?
That is the conclusion I would reach, yes. I think the public is way out in front of the politicians on this issue. The politicians have listened, I think, probably to the intensity of the argument rather than to the diversity of the argument, the widespread support that of freedom of a woman to make that decision, that very personal decision in consultation with her own conscience and her physician, rather than being restricted by a state law.
Mr. Rowan.
Ms. Steinem, this issue of abortion or reproductive freedom seems to be one of the burning issues among women in your group. What specifically is it you want? Do you want to wipe out all the bans and state-imposed prohibitions on abortion?
Yes, the position of the caucus is one against government intervention in the reproductive freedom of the individual citizen. That affects men as well as women. It means birth control as well as abortion. It also means the enforced sterilization laws, which exist in many states in this country and which affect criminals and any individual considered socially undesirable. Very often affects poor and minority people, welfare clients, and the like. And it's clear from the opinions in other industrialized countries, and also from the opinions here, that is not the wish of the average citizen, male and female, is not to have government intervention in that most private area of personal freedom.
Miss Mackin.
Yes. Ms. Ruckelshaus, recently President Nixon has taken strong positions against quotas, and it would seem to me, the way I interpret it, anything that can be construed as something that approaches a quota, which might also include positive action, a thing that has been used, and discrimination. Do you think that the President's position on this will adversely affect women's advancement in the society?
No, I don't think so. As a woman who has perfect confidence in women to achieve their representation based on their quality as well as their quantity, which happens to be over 50% of the population, I'm not concerned that if given an equal start, we won't eventually find ourselves well represented at the finish line. I don't think the President has said that there shouldn't be equal representation according to ability.
No, but the positive action is something that's been used throughout the 60s to get black people into the system, and to a more limited extent to get women into the system. So if that's removed, then what are we left with?
Well, that wasn't removed. You know, that was the basis for which a lot of juggling went on at the Republican convention. And in a certain rule which asked that succeeding conventions would endeavor to have equal representation of women, the term positive action was left in to say that the party must go out and include minorities, old people, young people, and women.
That has to do with the Republican Party. What I'm talking about is the society at large, the Philadelphia Plan, which the President's taken a very strong position on vis-a-vis black people. But also, if you carry that over to women, that's what I'm asking you, whether or not you think this will keep women from advancing.
No, I don't see that. I'm not clear on where you think the term positive action has been used to keep women from achieving their equal representation.
Positive action has been used as a legal means to involve people who are discriminated against.
Where has that been removed? Where has the President?
It's been used in industry, mostly in industry, especially for black people, and to a more limited extent for women.
Mrs. Ruckelshaus, will you answer that question first, or that statement?
I would like to say that I think with the eventual ratification of the ERA that many of those problems and those worries will be legitimately taken care of through the constitutional amendment.
Mrs. Ruckelshaus, a New York Post article quoted you as saying Republican women are different. They are not as vocal or emotional as the Democrats. If you were accurately quoted, what's your explanation for the difference between women Democrats and women Republicans?
Well, I'm not sure I can really explain that. I think I was accurately quoted, and I think I do believe that. And I'm not sure I can explain the difference. Maybe it's what leads them into either party in the first place. I do know that our approach at the Republican convention was quite different than the approach that the caucus women made at the Democrat convention. Yet we both achieved, I think, a very high level of success with our independent approaches. The women in both parties were responsive to the separate approaches that were used.
We have less than 4 minutes now. Mr. Kilpatrick.
Ms. Steinem, following up on Mr. Rowan's questions a moment ago, does the caucus also want to see all the laws against prostitution abolished?
There is no position on prostitution per se, but when we talk about equalizing the laws, obviously, that would have that effect. But I think we do have to say, relative to the questions, that we were just answering, the point is that the Republican women had, for instance, in the area of child care, had to deal with an administration which had just vetoed a child development bill. The Democratic women had to deal with a group already wedded to the idea of child care in general. So I think, we're talking about relativity of the struggle, and that's why we're part of one organization supporting each other and so on. But it would be unfair to leave the viewer with the impression that the women's plank in the area of child care and other areas were the same. They're not the same.
On the matter of the Equal Rights Amendment, the criticism is made that that's wonderful for you as a professional woman, but it doesn't do a thing on earth for the woman who works in a factory, in a home.
Well,
how do you respond to that?
That's wildly inaccurate, and I'm afraid that's a case of the unions using in the name of poor women, speaking against an Equal Rights Amendment, which will in fact help poor women very, very much. They have often wanted to maintain the so-called protective labor legislation in order to keep jobs within the union as a male province. In fact, they are being knocked down state by state under the 14th Amendment anyway. So the truth of that point of view would leave women without the protective legislation and without the Equal Rights Amendment. It's clear that it's in the interest of poor women, and the women of the UAW and other unions agree, to pass the Equal Rights Amendment with all speed.
Mr. Rowan.
Mrs. Ruckelshaus, some feminists say that it is the very institution of marriage itself that enslaves women, and that there won't be any real freedom for women until that's wiped out. Is that an argument that you accept?
No, it isn't. And I think what this movement is the full expression of a woman's potential. And that includes, for many women, a husband and a family. But that is not the full expression. The husband and family cannot be the fullest expression. I think many women stop short in their own evolution when they think they've reached their capacity when they're married and are raising a family.
Now, there are some other people who say that even talking about this gives the women's rights movement a bad name. Do you think it's bad for them to talk about wiping out the institution of marriage?
Oh, I don't think so. I think there are many people who are responsive to that argument. To another large segment of the woman population, of which I am a member, the institution of marriage is a very important part of my life. But it is not the entire reason for my being, Mr. Rowan.
We have less than a minute. Ms. Alexander.
Ms. Steinem, there's been a lot of talk about you yourself going actively into politics. Do you have some plans?
No, I have no such plans, but I look forward to working for women who are strong on women's issues and the issues of all powerless groups. I enjoy working at that, but I'm much more comfortable with a typewriter than here in public.
You have no plans for running for elective office?
No.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but our time is almost up, and we won't be able to get in another question or an answer. Thank you, Ms. Steinem and Mrs. Ruckelshaus, for being with us today on Meet the Press. I'll tell you about next week's guests in just a minute after this message.
This is the Grand Isle Tarpon Rodeo off the coast of Louisiana. It's always been one of the best places to sport fish. But oddly enough, the fishing really got good after the oil industry came to these waters. The giant platforms they built attracted marine growth. The growth attracted little fish, which in turn attracted big fish, and so on. Esso operates 64 of these platforms. We don't take any credit for the good fishing. That's a natural phenomenon. But on the other hand, if the waters weren't good for the fish, there wouldn't be so many little fish, which attract so many big fish, which attract so many fishermen.
For a printed copy of today's interview, send 10 cents in coin in a stamped, self-addressed envelope to Merkel Press, Box 2111, Washington, D.C. 20013.
Next Sunday, Meet the Press moves to a new time period, 30 minutes earlier than usual on most of these stations. Please check your local television listings for the exact time in your area. Our guests next Sunday on Meet the Press will be the chairman of the Republican Senate and House campaign committees, Senator Peter H. Dominick of Colorado, and Representative Bob Wilson of California. Now, this is Lawrence Spivak saying goodbye for Gloria Steinem, Jill Ruckelshaus, and Meet the Press.
The experiences of the victims of the pension system in the United States are spotlighted in the program that will initiate NBC Reports, hosted by NBC News correspondent Edwin Newman, this Tuesday night at 10, 9 Central Time, right here on NBC. This is Lee Dayton speaking. Meet the Press has been a public affairs presentation of NBC News and has come to you live from our studios in Washington, D.C.
Pensions. Many people look to them for a secure retirement, yet a staggering number never collect. What happens to these people and their money is explored in Pensions, The Broken Promise. It's the premiere of NBC Reports, weekly hour-long news specials, Tuesdays at 10, 9 Central Time.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.